Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're looking at a moment in time that completely defined an entire musical genre. Picture this, it's 1986. Thrash metal is just exploding out of the underground, and right at the absolute vanguard of this massive movement is Metallica. They're riding this huge critical and commercial wave from their legendary Master of Puppets album, unstoppable force of nature, right? Touring the world, playing faster and heavier than literally anyone else. But at the dead center of all that chaotic, aggressive energy was this singular grounding force, their bassist Cliff Burton. And Cliff wasn't just, a guy holding down the rhythm section. He was basically the band's musical compass. Classically trained, heavily inspired by Baroque composers and progressive rock, he brought this profound, almost orchestral depth to their raw thrash sound. Without his intricate bass lines and deep understanding of melody, the early magic of the band simply doesn't exist. So today, we're exploring the profound reality that Cliff Burton's tragic death didn't end Metallica, but in a strange, painful way, it actually forged them. So how did one playing card change rock history? I know it sounds like pure fiction, right? But to understand this ultimate butterfly effect, we have to look at the reality of their Damage Inc. tour in Europe, fall of '86. It was a completely grueling schedule. The band is crammed into this freezing, incredibly uncomfortable tour bus traveling across Scandinavia. The bunks are drafty, tensions are sky high just from sheer physical exhaustion, and everybody is just desperate for one decent night of sleep. And it's in this totally mundane, exhausting environment that a simple, completely random game of chance happened. A desperate bid between bandmates for the one halfway decent bunk on a desolate Swedish highway, literally setting into motion a tragedy that would irrevocably alter the trajectory of a global music empire. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is seeing the true fallout of that night by looking at the music that came immediately after. When Kirk Hammett and Cliff Burton decided to draw cards for that top bunk, absolutely no one could have anticipated the horror that would follow. The bus hit black ice, flipped, and Cliff was tragically killed. The surviving members were totally shattered, but they decided the only way to survive the loss was to just keep playing. And the contrast between their early work and what came next is staggering. Song structures morphed into these dense, complex, progressive labyrinths. Famously, the bass guitar on the new tracks was practically mixed completely out of existence, which was this visceral, almost subconscious reaction from a band that had just lost their anchor. They were building these massive sonic walls because the foundation they relied on was suddenly gone. The And Justice for All album, their next record, was harder, darker, and angrier than anything they'd done before. The reality of that studio environment was just incredibly heavy. The sessions were notoriously intense, basically a pressure cooker of unspoken mourning. Think about it. These were young men, barely in their 20s, who had just lost their brother and their teacher in a horrific, violent instant. When they stepped back into the recording booth, that trauma didn't stay outside. You aren't just hearing heavy metal when you listen to those sprawling, aggressive tracks. You are hearing genuine, unfiltered trauma. You're hearing the pain of an unimaginable loss channeled straight into their instruments. The rapid-fire drumming, those intricate guitar riffs, the sheer volume, it was all a coping mechanism. It was an expulsion of anger at the absolute randomness of the universe. Some say it was, quite literally, grief turned into music. And this brilliantly illustrates the legacy left behind and what was fundamentally taught during those early years. Before Cliff, Metallica was playing this incredibly fast, aggressive, punk-infused metal. But Cliff introduced them to the power of harmonies. He taught them classical music theory, about Bach, about layering melodies to create something epic, cinematic, and timeless. His musical genius fundamentally rewired how James Hetfield and Lars Ulrich even approached composing heavy metal. And his sudden absence didn't erase those crucial lessons, it actually crystallized them. Everything they wrote from that point forward utilized the architectural framework he left behind in their minds. Lars Ulrich has said that everything Metallica became after 1986 was built on Cliff's foundation. Let's move to X and see how this builds, because you can trace this profound theoretical legacy through absolutely every era of the band that followed. That foundation became structurally embedded in their very DNA. It's like an invisible hand guiding their creative process. Those massive stadium anthems, the intricate acoustic intros, the sprawling instrumentals, all of it owes a direct debt to the classical sensibilities introduced in this first 3 albums. You just can't separate the massive volume of music they've made, the sold-out arenas across the globe, and their status as absolute titans of the music industry from the teachings that were laid down before that tragic night in Sweden. His influence is in every riff, every solo, every album they've made since. So the crucial point is, let's go back to that freezing Swedish night on September 26, 1986. The bus is rattling down a dark, icy road. Kirk Hammett and Cliff Burton, totally fed up with the awful sleeping arrangements, decide to settle once and for all who gets to sleep in the best bunk. They don't flip a coin, they don't argue. They grab a deck of playing cards. Kirk pulls a card. Then, Cliff pulls a card. He looks at it, looks at Kirk, and says, "I want your bunk." Kirk goes to sleep up front. Cliff takes the top bunk. The ace of spades. Just process the sheer weight of that fact for a second. The entire landscape of heavy music, the millions of fans whose lives were soundtracked by this band, the evolution of an entire genre, all of it, balanced on the edge of a momentary distraction to pass the time on a boring bus ride. A card game. That single, fatal pull of a card in the middle of nowhere dictated an unbelievable tragedy and simultaneously ignited the fire that would forge one of the biggest bands in human history. One decision. That's all it took to rewrite rock history. These are the hidden hinges of our culture, the bizarre twists of fate that quietly shape the world as we know it. It really makes you wonder what other random, everyday choices have completely rewritten the course of history without us even knowing. If you want more stories like this, the moments nobody talks about, subscribe, because there are 100 more where this came from.